Good evening, everyone. Today I will be discussing a form of historic psychotherapy, the theory of mesmerism. So, without further ado, I would like to begin with the presentation. The history of mesmerism. Mesmerism can be dated back to ancient Egyptians and Greeks, where hieroglyphics show evidence of magnetic sleep being practiced in the temple of Isis, an Egyptian goddess, and Greek mythology stating that Zeus, the god of the sky, could restore his disciples' health by a simple touch. There are also depictions of mesmerism found in Christianity, where Jesus of Nazareth would go about healing those who had faith in him from their ailments, such as healing a woman with a fever by touching her hand, and in the more extreme case, healing a man with leprosy by touching him and affirming to him that he had been healed. We also see glimpses of mesmerism in exorcism. For instance, in the early 1770s, a Jesuit priest, Father Gasner, began the practice of exorcism to cure those who came to him. However, he attributed the success of his treatment to spiritual beliefs and to supernatural elements. To Father Gasner, he was simply driving away evil spirits. So that brings us to the question, what is mesmerism? Mesmerism, also known as animal magnetism, was the invention of Franz Anton Mesmer, a German physician born in 1734 with an interest in astronomy. He began exploring how the gravitational effects of planetary movement affected the human body, theorizing that since the planetary movements have a gravitational effect on the tides, it could also have an effect on our body fluid, and figuring out the science behind it could help find the cure to many illnesses. The basic premise being the flow of the magnetic body fluid facing disruptions leading to illnesses, and so he figured that using magnets could help remove these obstructions in the flow path of the fluid by opposing the forces of gravity, thus ridding one of their ailments. Mesmer's work was heavily plagiarized from English physician Richard Mead, who devised a similar theory in 1704 and wrote a paper called Of the Power and Influence of Sun and Moon on Humane Bodies and of the Disease that Arise from Thence. There was also another physician in the 1600s with a similar theory, Paracelsus, and he claimed that fluid from the earth and stars that disrupt our natural flow could be sent back to their point of origin in the universe by the use of magnets. Animal magnetism therapy: the rise and the fall. In 1774, Mesmer first practiced his theory on a young woman who had repetitive attacks or seizures, and he did so by attaching magnets to the woman's chest and her feet. Despite initial discomfort, the woman grew desensitized to the push and pull effect the magnets had on her, and eventually her seizures stopped and her symptoms reduced. This led to him coining the term animal magnetism, meant to describe the magnetic body fluid that flowed through us. In time he stopped using magnets and would resort to using his hands, as he believed the magnetic fluid in him was enough to heal his patients. He would maintain a gaze with his patients and raise his hand in a particular manner, and the patients would begin convulsing and leave cured. Sometimes he would stroke the patient's body parts with his hands to channel the magnetic fluid to its correct flow, while other times he would just have to command his patients and they would begin convulsing. And this is where one might draw similarities between early practices of mesmerism and exorcism, namely the interaction between the two parties and the convulsions thereafter. Of course, one having spiritual undertones while the other being grounded in science. In 1784, mesmerism was debunked by Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, Joseph Ignace Guillotin, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and other scholars called in by King Louis XVI to conduct a scientific investigation, one of the first of its kind, on the matter. The results of their investigation was that when people could see what was magnetized, they would have healing effects, and when they did not know what was magnetized, there were no effects at all, thus leading them to conclude that the curing effects were only a part of the patient's imaginations. This was what they wrote in the first report. The second report, written specifically for King Louis XVI, claimed that mesmerism was unethical, as it put the patients' lives in danger by bringing them in a trance-like state where they would be vulnerable to do whatever is commanded. The results were spread through the French population, and mesmerism became largely disgraced. Now we delve into other majorly successful treatment methods derived from mesmerism, the first one being magnetic sleep. Marcus de Puysegur was a friend and colleague of Mesmer, and he believed in the theory of mesmerism. However, he did not like the convulsions Mesmer's patients would experience during the healing process, and so he thought of a way in which the therapy could be carried out in a calm manner, resulting in magnetic sleep, which was a sleep-like state the patients went into during the therapeutic process and awoke cured. So, if a calm method of treatment was possible, why did Mesmer think of convulsions as the sign of a cure? We understand now that most of his patients were women suffering from mild hysteria, who experienced seizures and fits during the process of therapy, which was mesmerism. They would relieve their psychic tension, which we now know in psychoanalysis as abreaction, in the form of said convulsions, which is why he saw it as a crucial part of the treatment process and did not consider magnetic sleep, since to him it seemed unbearing of results. The second successful treatment method derived from mesmerism was suggestibility or post-hypnotic suggestions. Suggestibility was another method of treatment that stemmed from mesmerism and was created by Jean Deleuze, a student of Pessager, who would use post-hypnotic suggestions to cure his patients. For instance, he would tell his patient after the session that they would experience discharge from their nose next Friday, and once that happens, they will be cured. Hypnotists still use this method in modern-day practices. The spread of mesmerism. Based in France, Abbé Faria was a Portuguese mesmerist in the 1800s who took a different approach to mesmerism that seems closer to modern-day hypnosis. He would maintain eye contact with his patients whilst telling them what to do. He would command his patients to sleep while he held their gaze, and sleep they would. With those unaffected, he would move his hand closer to their face, making them close their eyes, and they would enter deep sleep. If one was still unaffected, he would touch parts of their body lightly to gain their concentration, and once he had their complete concentration, he would command them to sleep, and they would. As mesmerism spread to the UK in the late 1830s, Dr. John Elliotson, a physician in London, took interest in mesmerism. However, his belief was that mesmerism was not rooted in the mind, but had to do with something more physical such as magnetism or electricity. Science had advanced though, and since mesmerism had been long since labeled an immoral practice and with no legitimacy to be maintained on the matter otherwise, research into mesmerism was dropped. Meanwhile, in 1846, Scottish surgeon James S10 would perform surgeries on male patients in India who had been put in deep sleep through mesmerism, and these men would wake up with no recollection of an operation ever being performed. These men had gone into surgery with no anesthesia and had not felt a thing during the surgical procedure. The surgeries were performed on poor Indians, and so high-class Indians and colonial Britishers would not go for treatment to Esdale. It was also around this time that ether, chloroform, and nitrous oxide came into use, and so mesmerism was again pushed to the side. Now spread to the US, mesmerism was being performed by one in particular, John Dodds, who would hold a coin in front of the patient and command them to stare at it, and would claim that the metal has an influence on the patient. He called this electrobiology. But what he was actually doing was giving the patient something to concentrate on and enter a mesmeric trance. And that is how mesmerism spread from France to the UK, to India, and finally to the US. In the early 1840s, Scottish surgeon James Braid theorized that the effects of mesmerism were not due to the magnetic body fluid, but instead due to suggestibility. He claimed that the patients benefited from mesmerism because they believed when they were told that they would benefit from it, and this belief brought about the results. He gave birth to hypnotism, where no physical contact was required, which was initially required in mesmerism to channel magnetic body fluid, but with hypnotism he would only have to maintain his gaze with the patient or provide the patient with an object to concentrate on, where the patient would have to do an upwards and inward squint to look at the object. Braid's work on hypnosis caught the attention of Sigmund Freud, who whilst having a hypnotic session with a patient, had the patient wake up from magnetic sleep and throw her arms around his neck. Now, the Royal Commission had expressed the immoral nature of the relationship between the mesmerizer or hypnotist and the patient, since it was evident that the more submissive, vulnerable, and believing patients were the ones that hypnotism and mesmerism worked best on. Thus the experience with the patient deterred Freud from practicing hypnotism as a form of therapy. Instead, he noticed that during the magnetic sleep state in hypnosis, the patients would experience temporary amnesia, and he tried to bring their memories back using commands. He began trying the concentration method, where he would tell his patients to concentrate on particular memories instead of objects. Eventually, he assumed that his patients must know what the cure to their ailments are, and by having them concentrate, he was actually helping them find the cure. This is how psychoanalysis and two major components of psychoanalysis, namely resistance and transference, were created. Therefore, to conclude, what began as something deeply rooted in ancient history to being strikingly similar to exorcism turned into magnetic sleep, then suggestibility, then hypnosis, which was basically magnetic sleep and suggestibility combined, and finally into psychoanalysis that we learn about in modern day psychotherapy. And that is the evolution of mesmerism.